I was delivering the eulogy at my wife's funeral when a woman in the back stood up and said she was my wife's daughter. She was 40 years old. My wife and I had been married for 42 years. I'd known my wife since we were teenagers. We'd never had children. This woman had documents, birth certificates, photos, letters, proof that my wife had given birth at 16 and given the baby up for adoption, proof that my wife had a whole part of her life I knew nothing about. The funeral was at Riverside Chapel in Columbus, a beautiful old church with stained glass windows and wooden pews that had been there for over 100 years. My wife Margaret had loved this church. We'd been married here in 1981. She'd wanted her funeral service here too. She'd planned everything before she died. The music, the flowers, the readings, everything except this moment, this interruption, this revelation. There were over 200 people in the church. Family, friends, neighbors, people Margaret had worked with over the years, people from the garden club she'd belonged to, people from the book club, people whose lives she'd touched in the 73 years she'd lived, all of them sitting quietly, listening to me talk about the woman I'd loved for nearly 5 decades. I was halfway through the eulogy, talking about how Margaret and I had met in high school, how she'd been kind and funny and smart, how she'd made every day better just by being in it, how much I'd miss her now that she was gone. Standard funeral talk, the kind of things you say when someone dies and you're trying to capture a whole life in a few minutes of speech. The woman stood up during a pause. She was in the back row. I hadn't noticed her before. Dark hair, professional clothing. She looked nervous but determined. She said "excuse me" in a voice that carried through the whole church. Everyone turned to look at her. I stopped speaking, asked if something was wrong. She said she was sorry for interrupting, that she knew this wasn't the right time, but that she needed to say something before the service ended, before Margaret was buried, before it was too late. I asked what she needed to say. Probably sounded annoyed. This was my wife's funeral. This woman was disrupting a sacred moment. Whatever she had to say could surely wait. She said her name was Jennifer Campbell, that she was Margaret's daughter, that Margaret had given birth to her in 1983 when Margaret was 16 years old, that she'd been put up for adoption but had found her biological mother 10 years ago, that she and Margaret had been in contact for a decade, that Margaret had been part of her life even though I apparently knew nothing about it. The church went completely silent. 200 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if this was real or if this woman was disturbed, waiting for me to respond. I stood at the podium, looking at this stranger, this woman claiming to be my wife's daughter, my wife who I'd known since she was 15 years old, my wife who'd told me everything about her life, my wife who'd never mentioned having a baby, never mentioned giving up a child for adoption, never mentioned any of this. I said there must be some mistake, that Margaret didn't have any children, that we'd tried for years to have kids and couldn't, that it was one of the great sorrows of our marriage, that if Margaret had already had a child before we met, she would have told me. Jennifer said she understood this was a shock, that she hadn't wanted to disrupt the funeral, but that she was Margaret's daughter, that she had proof, birth certificate with Margaret's name, adoption papers, letters Margaret had written to her over the past 10 years, photos of them together. Everything documented and verified. My son-in-law Michael stood up, except he wasn't actually my son-in-law because Margaret and I had never had children. Michael was my nephew. He'd grown up thinking of us as his aunt and uncle. He'd been like a son to us. Now he was looking at Jennifer with confusion and something else. Recognition, maybe. Michael said he'd seen her before, at the hospital when Margaret was dying. Jennifer had been there, in the waiting room. Margaret had introduced her as a friend from work, but now he realized Margaret had retired 15 years ago. Why would a work friend from that long ago be at the hospital during Margaret's final days? Jennifer said she'd been there because Margaret had asked her to come, that Margaret had wanted to say goodbye to her daughter, that they'd had a private conversation while the rest of the family was getting coffee, that Margaret had told her she loved her, that Margaret had cried and apologized for giving her up, that it had been one of the hardest moments of Jennifer's life. I felt like the floor was tilting. Nothing made sense. My wife of 42 years, the woman I'd loved since I was 17, the woman I'd thought I knew better than anyone. She'd had a secret daughter, had been in contact with this daughter for 10 years, had seen her during her final days in the hospital, all without ever telling me. The funeral director approached the podium, asked if we should take a break, give everyone time to process, maybe continue the service later. He was trying to be helpful, but his voice sounded far away, like I was underwater, like this wasn't really happening. I said no. We'd continue. but I wanted to see Jennifer's proof, wanted to see these documents she claimed to have. If this was real, if Margaret really had a daughter I'd never known about, I needed to understand. Jennifer came forward, walked up the center aisle of the church while 200 people watched. She had a folder with her. She handed it to me at the podium. I opened it with shaking hands. The first document was a birth certificate. Baby girl, born March 15, 1983. Mother's name, Margaret Louise Peterson. That was Margaret's maiden name. She'd been Margaret Peterson before we married, before she became Margaret Holland. The father's name was listed as unknown. The baby had been born at Columbus General Hospital. Weight 6 pounds 4 ounces. Healthy. I did the math in my head. March 1983. That meant Margaret had gotten pregnant around June 1982. We'd started dating in September 1982. She'd been 16. I'd been 17. We'd been high school juniors. If she'd given birth in March, she'd been pregnant when we met. Pregnant when we started dating. Pregnant through our entire first year together. How had I not known? How had she hidden a pregnancy? We'd been together constantly that year. Study partners, lab partners in chemistry class. We'd spent every day together. How could she have been pregnant and I never noticed? The next document was adoption paperwork, dated March 20th, 1983, 5 days after the birth. Margaret Louise Peterson, age 16, relinquishing parental rights. The adoptive parents were listed as Robert and Susan Campbell from Cleveland. The adoption was closed. No contact allowed between biological mother and child. Standard procedure for the time. Then there were letters, dozens of them, written in Margaret's handwriting. I'd know that handwriting anywhere. She'd written me thousands of notes and cards over the years. Love notes, shopping lists, birthday cards. Her handwriting was as familiar to me as my own. These letters were addressed to Jennifer, written over the past 10 years. The first one dated 2013. Dear Jennifer, I received your letter yesterday. I cannot tell you how many times I've dreamed of this moment, how many times I've wondered about you, hoped you were happy, prayed you were loved. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for giving me a chance to explain. I couldn't read more, not standing at the podium in front of 200 people, not at my wife's funeral, not while trying to process that Margaret had kept this enormous secret for our entire marriage. I looked at Jennifer, really looked at her. She had Margaret's eyes, the same green-gray color that changed depending on the light, the same shape. I'd loved Margaret's eyes, had looked into them thousands of times over 42 years. And this stranger had the same eyes. She also had Margaret's smile. I could see it, even though she looked nervous and sad. The way her mouth curved, the way her whole face lit up when she smiled. I'd seen that smile every day for decades, and now I was seeing it on someone else's face. I asked her to sit down, told the funeral director to continue with the service. We'd deal with this later. Right now, we needed to finish saying goodbye to Margaret. Whatever else was true, whatever secrets had been revealed, Margaret deserved a proper funeral. The service continued. The pastor read from Psalms. Margaret's friend Susan sang Amazing Grace. Michael gave a short speech about what Margaret had meant to our family. People cried, people hugged, people filed past the casket to say their final goodbyes. Standard funeral rituals, except nothing was standard anymore. Everything had changed in the space of a few minutes. Jennifer sat in the back row through all of it, crying quietly, mourning a mother she'd only known for 10 years, a mother who'd given her up at birth, a mother who'd kept her existence secret from her husband, from everyone who'd known her. After the service, we went to the cemetery, Green Hills Memorial Park. Margaret and I had bought plots there years ago, side by side, planning to spend eternity together just like we'd spent our lives. Except now I was learning that Margaret had spent a significant part of her life somewhere I'd never been, in a secret relationship with a daughter I'd never known existed. They lowered Margaret's casket into the ground. The pastor said the final prayers. People threw flowers onto the casket. The cemetery workers would fill in the grave later, after everyone left. That's how it worked. You said goodbye and then you left, and strangers did the hard work of burying your loved one. Jennifer stood at a distance during the burial, not with the family, not with the main group of mourners, off to the side like she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. And I suppose she wasn't sure. She'd just disrupted her biological mother's funeral, just revealed a secret that had been kept for 40 years, just turned the grieving widower's world upside down. People came back to our house after the burial. There's always food after funerals. Neighbors had brought casseroles and desserts. The dining room table was covered with dishes. People ate and talked and shared memories of Margaret. Normal funeral reception activities. Jennifer stood in the corner of the living room. People were staring at her, whispering. Everyone had heard what happened at the church. News like that spreads instantly. The woman who claimed to be Margaret's secret daughter. The revelation at the funeral. The proof she'd brought. It was the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. I approached her, asked if we could talk privately. She nodded. We went to my study, the room where I'd spent countless hours working, where Margaret would bring me coffee and sit with me while I graded papers. I'd been a high school history teacher for 40 years. This study was full of memories. Now it was about to be filled with explanations. I asked Jennifer to tell me everything, from the beginning, how she'd found Margaret, what their relationship had been, why Margaret had never told me. Jennifer took a deep breath. She said she'd always known she was adopted. Robert and Susan Campbell had been wonderful parents. They'd never hidden it from her. They'd told her when she was young that she was chosen, that her biological mother had loved her but couldn't keep her, that she'd been given to parents who desperately wanted a child. She'd had a happy childhood, good parents, good home. She'd never felt the need to search for her biological family, until Robert died when Jennifer was 28. Heart attack, sudden and devastating. A year later, Susan was diagnosed with cancer. She died when Jennifer was 30. Within 2 years, Jennifer had lost both her parents. That's when she'd started wondering about her biological family. Not because the Campbells weren't her real parents. They were. They'd raised her and loved her and made her who she was. But they were gone. And Jennifer felt alone in a way she'd never felt before. She wanted to know where she came from, who she looked like, whether she had biological family out there. She'd hired a search service. They'd found Margaret within 3 months. Birth records weren't sealed as tightly as they used to be, especially for older adoptions. They'd located Margaret Peterson Holland living in Columbus, still in the same city where Jennifer had been born. Jennifer had written a letter, introduced herself, said she was the baby Margaret had given up for adoption in 1983, that she wasn't looking for anything except maybe a chance to meet, to understand her story, to know where she came from. Margaret had responded immediately, called Jennifer on the phone 2 days after receiving the letter. They'd talked for 3 hours that first conversation. Margaret had cried, had apologized, had explained that giving Jennifer up had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, that she'd thought about Jennifer every single day for 30 years, that not a birthday went by without Margaret wondering what Jennifer was doing, whether she was happy, whether she felt loved. They'd met in person a week later, at a coffee shop in Cleveland, halfway between Columbus and where Jennifer lived. Margaret had driven up alone, told me she was visiting a friend. That was the first of many lies, many secret meetings, many hours of relationship that Margaret had built with Jennifer, while I thought she was doing other things. I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since this started. Why didn't Margaret tell me? Why keep Jennifer secret? We'd been married for 42 years. We'd shared everything, or so I'd thought. Why hide this? Jennifer said she'd asked Margaret the same thing. Many times over the 10 years they'd known each other. Jennifer had said she'd be happy to meet me, to be introduced to Margaret's family, to have some kind of relationship that wasn't secret. But Margaret had always said no, had always insisted that Jennifer remain hidden. Margaret's explanation, according to Jennifer, was complicated. She'd said that when we got married, she'd wanted to tell me about the baby, about the pregnancy she'd hidden, about the adoption, but I'd just proposed. We were young and happy, and planning our future. Margaret was afraid that telling me would ruin everything, that I'd feel betrayed, that I'd wonder what else she'd hidden, that I'd question whether I really knew her at all. So she'd decided to wait, tell me later, after we were more settled, after married a few years, after our relationship was stronger. But then, time passed. We tried to have children and couldn't. The doctors said it was unexplained infertility. We went through tests and treatments, spent years hoping for a baby that never came. Margaret had wanted to tell me then that she'd already had a baby, that she'd given birth when she was 16, that maybe there was something wrong because of that early pregnancy. But how could she explain keeping it secret for so many years? How could she tell me she'd been pregnant when we met, that she'd hidden it throughout our entire relationship? More time passed. We gave up on having children, accepted that we'd be childless, built a life around just the two of us. Margaret said the moment to tell me had passed, that revealing the secret would hurt me without changing anything, that Jennifer was gone, given to another family, closed adoption, no contact. Why dredge up the past and cause pain for no purpose? Then Jennifer found her, and Margaret had a choice: tell me and risk our marriage, or keep Jennifer secret and maintain both relationships separately. She'd chosen secrecy. She'd chosen to have a relationship with her daughter while hiding it from her husband. For 10 years, I sat in my study listening to all this, trying to understand, trying to imagine Margaret's perspective, trying to make sense of why the woman I'd loved would keep something this enormous from me. But I couldn't understand it, couldn't accept it. Yes, telling me would have been hard. Yes, I would have been shocked, but we could have worked through it. We could have figured it out together. Instead, Margaret had chosen to lie, to hide, to live a double life where she was one person with me and another person with Jennifer. I asked Jennifer what else she knew, what other secrets Margaret had shared, what else I didn't know about my own wife. Jennifer hesitated, said there was more. Things Margaret had told her about that time in her life, about the pregnancy, about the father, about why she'd given Jennifer up for adoption. I needed to know, even if it hurt, even if it changed how I understood our entire marriage. I needed the truth. Jennifer said Margaret had gotten pregnant at 15, summer before her junior year of high school. There had been a boy, someone she'd known from school. They'd dated briefly. He'd been her first boyfriend, her first everything. The relationship hadn't lasted. They'd broken up at the end of summer, but Margaret had already been pregnant. She hadn't told the boy, hadn't told anyone. She'd been terrified, ashamed. This was 1982. Teen pregnancy carried stigma. Margaret had come from a religious family, conservative values. Her parents would have been devastated, furious. She couldn't face telling them, so she'd hidden it, worn loose clothing, avoided situations where people would see her body, claimed she'd gained weight, made excuses for why she couldn't do certain activities. Somehow she'd managed to hide the pregnancy for 9 months. Even from me, even from the boy I'd been when we started dating. Jennifer asked if I remembered anything odd about that year. Any signs that Margaret might have been pregnant. I thought back, 41 years ago, junior year of high school, when Margaret and I started dating. I remembered she'd worn baggy clothes, sweaters and loose shirts even when it was warm. I'd thought it was just her style. Remembered she'd gotten sick sometimes. Morning sickness, I realized now, but she'd said it was a stomach bug. I'd believed her. I remembered she'd missed some school in March, said she had the flu, had been out for 2 weeks. That must have been when she'd given birth, when she'd had Jennifer and given her up for adoption, when she'd gone through something traumatic and life-changing while telling everyone she just had the flu. How had no one noticed? How had her parents not realized their daughter was pregnant? How had I spent every day with her and never suspected? Jennifer said Margaret's parents had noticed something was wrong, but Margaret had convinced them it was stress, school pressure, teenage hormones. They'd wanted to believe her, wanted to think their daughter was fine, so they'd accepted her explanations, hadn't pushed too hard, hadn't looked too closely. When Margaret went into labor, she'd gone to the hospital alone, told her parents she was staying at a friend's house for the weekend, told the hospital she was 16, and emancipated, checked herself in, had the baby, signed the adoption papers, recovered for a few days, then went home, like nothing had happened. Jennifer said Margaret had described it as the most isolating experience of her life, going through labor and birth completely alone, no family, no friends, no support, just medical staff who processed her like any other patient. She'd held Jennifer for an hour after birth, then signed the papers and Jennifer was taken away. Margaret never saw her again until Jennifer was 30 years old and reached out. I sat there absorbing all this, trying to imagine Margaret at 16, pregnant and terrified and alone, giving birth and giving up her baby, then coming back to normal life like nothing had happened, going to school, dating me, building a relationship while carrying this secret. Part of me felt sympathy. She'd been a child herself, scared, without support, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Of course she'd hidden it. Of course she'd tried to move on. What else could she have done? But another part of me felt betrayed. She'd had 42 years to tell me. We'd been married for decades. We'd shared a life. We'd promised to be honest with each other, to face everything together. And she'd kept this secret the entire time. Had met Jennifer and built a relationship with her and still never told me. I asked Jennifer what Margaret had said about me. Did she know why Margaret had kept me in the dark? Did Margaret ever express regret about the lying? Jennifer said Margaret talked about me all the time, with love and affection. She'd called me the best thing that ever happened to her, the love of her life, the person who'd made her feel safe and valued and cherished. She'd been grateful every day that we'd found each other, but Margaret had also been afraid. Afraid that learning about Jennifer would change how I saw her, that I'd see her as damaged or dishonest, that I'd wonder what else she'd hidden, that the revelation would poison our marriage. Jennifer said Margaret had planned to tell me eventually, that she'd been working up to it, but then she'd gotten sick, diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, terminal. The doctors had given her maybe 3 years. She'd lived just under 2. Once she knew she was dying, Margaret had decided to keep the secret. Decided it would be cruel to tell me when we had so little time left. Why burden me with this revelation when we should be focused on the time we had remaining? Why force me to process something this complicated when I was already dealing with losing her? So Margaret had kept seeing Jennifer secretly, meeting her for lunch every few weeks, talking on the phone, building their relationship, planning for after Margaret was gone. She'd told Jennifer about our life together, about our home and our friends and our routines. She'd wanted Jennifer to know her mother, to understand who Margaret had been, to have some connection even after death. What Margaret hadn't planned on was Jennifer coming to the funeral. They'd discussed it. Margaret had said maybe it would be better if Jennifer stayed away. Let me mourn, without complications. Let the secret stay buried with her. But Jennifer couldn't do it. Couldn't let her mother be buried without acknowledging their relationship. Couldn't stand at the back of the church watching everyone mourn Margaret while she stayed silent about being her daughter. So she'd stood up, spoken out, revealed everything. I asked Jennifer if she regretted it, if she wished she'd stayed quiet like Margaret had wanted. Jennifer said no. She knew it had caused pain, knew it had disrupted the funeral, knew it had probably made me angry and hurt, but she couldn't hide anymore. Couldn't pretend she didn't exist. Couldn't let Margaret's death erase their relationship like it had never happened. She said she understood if I was angry, if I didn't want to have any relationship with her going forward. She wasn't asking for anything from me, wasn't claiming to be my daughter. She knew I wasn't her father. We had no biological or legal relationship, but she wanted me to know that she'd loved Margaret, that their 10 years together had meant everything to her, that Margaret had been a good mother even if that relationship had been secret and limited, that Margaret had died knowing her daughter and being known by her. That had to count for something. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how I felt. Angry, yes. Betrayed, absolutely. But also sad. Sad for Margaret carrying this secret for so long. Sad for Jennifer growing up without her biological mother. Sad for all of us caught in this complicated situation. The guests were leaving. The funeral reception was ending. People were saying their goodbyes, offering their condolences, promising to check on me in the coming weeks. No one mentioned Jennifer directly, but everyone was thinking about her, about what her revelation meant, about how it changed everything we thought we knew about Margaret. Jennifer said she should go, that she'd intruded enough. She left her contact information, phone number, email address, said if I ever wanted to talk or had questions, she'd answer anything I wanted to know. Then she left. I sat in my empty house, surrounded by casserole dishes and funeral flowers, the house where Margaret and I had lived for 35 years, the house filled with memories of our life together. Except now those memories felt different, tainted by knowledge that Margaret had been hiding something the whole time. I went upstairs to our bedroom. Our closet still had Margaret's clothes. Her dresser still had her jewelry and makeup. Everything was still where she'd left it. The cancer had taken her relatively quickly once it got bad. We hadn't had time to sort through her belongings, to decide what to keep and what to give away. That task still waited. I started looking through Margaret's things, not to clean them out, to search, to look for evidence of Jennifer, to see what else Margaret might have hidden. In the back of her closet, behind her winter coats, I found a box. Cardboard storage box. Not very big. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Pictures of Jennifer from infancy through adulthood. Baby pictures that must have come from the adoption agency or Jennifer's adoptive parents. School photos from elementary school through high school graduation. College photos. Adult photos. A complete visual record of Jennifer's life that Margaret had somehow acquired. There were also letters. The letters Jennifer had mentioned. Correspondence between Margaret and Jennifer over 10 years. Margaret's side of the conversation. Dear Jennifer, thank you for your last letter. It means so much to hear about your life. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. There were cards. Birthday cards for Jennifer that Margaret had bought but never sent. Christmas cards. Mother's Day cards that said, "From your mom" in Margaret's handwriting. Cards she'd written but kept instead of mailing, like she was practicing being Jennifer's mother even though their relationship had to stay secret. And there was a journal, Margaret's handwriting, dated entries going back to 1983, the year Jennifer was born. Margaret had been writing about Jennifer for 40 years. I started reading. The first entry was from March 1983. I had my baby today, a girl. She's beautiful, perfect. I held her for an hour. Then I signed the papers. They took her away. I'll never see her again. I'll never stop thinking about her. More entries followed, sporadic at first, then more regular. Jennifer turns one today. I wonder what she looks like now, if she's walking yet, if her parents celebrate her birthday, if they tell her about me. Jennifer is 5 today, starting kindergarten. I imagine her with a little backpack, going to school for the first time. I wonder if she's scared or excited. I wish I could be there. Jennifer is 16 today, the age I was when she was born. I hope her life is easier than mine was at this age. I hope she's happy and safe and loved. The entries continued through Jennifer's 20s, Margaret writing to a daughter she'd never met, recording her thoughts and hopes and regrets, creating a one-sided relationship in the pages of a journal. Then the entries changed. 2013. Jennifer found me. She wrote me a letter. I called her today. We talked for 3 hours. She sounds wonderful, smart and kind. She had good parents. I'm so relieved. I met Jennifer today. She looks like me, has my eyes, my smile. Seeing her was like looking at myself at 30. I wanted to hug her and never let go, but we're still strangers. We have to take this slow. Jennifer and I meet for lunch once a month now. It's wonderful and terrible at the same time. Wonderful to know her. Terrible that I can't share this with George. I want to tell him. But how? After all these years? After all the lying? He'll feel betrayed. Our marriage might not survive it. More entries. More meetings with Jennifer. More agonizing about whether to tell me. More rationalization for keeping the secret. Then the cancer diagnosis. The doctor says I have 2 or 3 years. Maybe less. I need to tell George about Jennifer. I need to introduce them. I need to make this right before I die. But I'm scared. Scared of hurting him. Scared of losing him. Scared that our last years together will be ruined by this revelation. I've decided not to tell George. It's selfish. I know that. But I can't face telling him now. Can't handle the pain it would cause. Can't risk our remaining time together. I'll let him remember me as the woman he thought he married, not the woman who lied to him for 40 years. The last entry was from a month before Margaret died. Jennifer wants to come to my funeral. I told her it might be too complicated, that it might be better to keep our relationship private, let George mourn without this burden. But she says she needs to acknowledge our connection, to honor me publicly. I understand, but I'm afraid of what this will do to George. Afraid I'm being cowardly by not telling him myself. Afraid my death will cause more pain than it should. I closed the journal, sat on the floor of Margaret's closet surrounded by the evidence of her secret life. The photos, the letters, the cards, the journal entries spanning 40 years, all of it hidden from me, all of it part of a Margaret I'd never known, existed. I felt multiple things at once. Anger at being lied to, betrayal that my wife had kept something this significant from me, sadness at Margaret's isolation, understanding why a terrified 16-year-old had hidden her pregnancy, confusion about how to process all of this. I spent hours in that closet, reading through everything, looking at photos of Jennifer growing up, seeing Margaret's daughter become a woman, watching a life unfold that Margaret had witnessed from a distance and then up close but had never shared with me. There was one photo near the bottom of the box, recent, maybe a year old, Margaret and Jennifer together, at a restaurant, both smiling, Margaret's arm around Jennifer. They looked happy. They looked like mother and daughter, like they belonged together. I'd never seen Margaret look at anyone the way she was looking at Jennifer in that photo, with such pure love and joy and pride. She'd looked at me with love, of course, but this was different. This was a mother looking at her child, something Margaret and I had never experienced together, something I'd thought we'd been deprived of. Turns out Margaret had experienced it, just not with me. The next few days were difficult. The house felt empty without Margaret, but it also felt like it wasn't really my house anymore, like I'd been living in a stage set, playing a role in a marriage that wasn't quite what I'd thought it was. People came by to check on me, brought more food, offered condolences, asked how I was holding up. I said I was fine, dealing with it, managing, standard responses. What else could I say? That my entire marriage felt like a lie? That I didn't know who my wife had been? That I was grieving while also being angry? Michael came by 3 days after the funeral. He'd been thinking about everything, about Jennifer's revelation, about the implications. He asked how I was really doing, not the polite answer. The truth, I told him I didn't know, that I was processing, that I'd found Margaret's journals and photos and letters, that I now knew more about the secret, but understood less about why Margaret had kept it, that I was angry and sad and confused all at the same time. Michael asked if I was going to have any relationship with Jennifer. She was technically his cousin now, his aunt's biological daughter. That made them related somehow. He'd been thinking about reaching out to her, but wanted to know how I felt about it first. I said I didn't know, hadn't decided. Part of me wanted nothing to do with Jennifer. She represented Margaret's deception. Every time I'd see her, I'd think about the lying, about the secret life Margaret had led, about everything I hadn't known. But another part of me was curious. Jennifer had known a side of Margaret I'd never seen, had conversations with her I'd never heard, had a relationship with her that was different from mine. Maybe understanding that relationship would help me understand Margaret better, help me make sense of why she'd done what she'd done. Michael said he thought I should talk to Jennifer, not decide about a relationship yet, just talk, hear her perspective, understand more about what those 10 years had been like, what Margaret had been like with her. He was probably right. I had questions. Jennifer had answers. The only way to move forward was to get those answers, to fill in the gaps in my understanding, to learn about the Margaret I hadn't known. I called Jennifer a week after the funeral, asked if we could meet, talk more extensively than we'd been able to at my house during the reception. She said yes immediately, offered to come to Columbus, to meet wherever was convenient for me. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory, public enough that it wouldn't be too intense, but private enough that we could talk honestly. Jennifer got there first. She looked nervous, probably wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about, whether I was going to yell at her or blame her or tell her to stay away. I sat down across from her, looked at Margaret's eyes in a stranger's face. It was unsettling, like seeing a ghost. But Jennifer wasn't a ghost. She was real. She was here. She was part of Margaret's legacy, whether I wanted that or not. I asked her to tell me about her relationship with Margaret. Everything, from the first phone call to the last conversation in the hospital. I wanted to understand who Margaret had been with her daughter, what they'd talked about, what their dynamic had been. Jennifer talked for over an hour, describing their monthly lunches, their phone calls, the way their relationship had evolved from awkward to comfortable to genuinely close. She said Margaret had been interested in everything about her life, her job, her friends, her hobbies. Margaret had wanted to know all the things she'd missed, all the years she hadn't been there. Jennifer said Margaret had also shared things about her own life, stories from her childhood, memories from high school, things about her parents and her upbringing. But Margaret had been careful not to talk too much about me, about our marriage, about our life together, like she was keeping those parts of her life separate, maintaining boundaries between her relationship with Jennifer and her relationship with me. I asked if Margaret had ever indicated she felt guilty about keeping Jennifer secret from me. Jennifer said yes, that Margaret brought it up frequently, that she'd agonize over it, that she'd say she knew it was wrong but couldn't figure out how to make it right, that too much time had passed, that the lie had gotten too big to undo. Jennifer said Margaret had asked for advice. Should she tell me? How should she tell me? What would happen if she did? Jennifer had always said yes. Tell him, be honest, give him a chance to understand. But Margaret had never been able to do it, had always found a reason to wait, to postpone, to keep the secret just a little longer. I asked the hard question. Did Jennifer think Margaret had loved me, really loved me? Or had our marriage been built on a foundation of lies that made it something less than genuine? Jennifer's answer surprised me. She said Margaret had loved me deeply, that she'd talked about me with such affection and gratitude, that I was clearly the center of her world, that Jennifer had sometimes felt jealous of how much Margaret obviously adored her husband. She said the secret hadn't been about me, hadn't been because Margaret didn't love me or trust me. It had been about Margaret's shame, about her fear of being seen as someone who'd made mistakes, who'd hidden things, who wasn't the person everyone thought she was. Margaret had built an identity as George Holland's wife, as a respected member of the community, as someone reliable and trustworthy and straightforward. She'd been afraid that revealing this secret would destroy that identity, would make people see her differently, would make me see her differently. Jennifer said Margaret had been trapped by her own deception. The longer she kept the secret, the harder it became to tell. The more years that passed, the bigger the betrayal seemed. She'd been paralyzed by shame and fear, unable to move forward, but unable to go back and fix what she'd done. I sat there listening to Jennifer describe Margaret's internal struggle, trying to reconcile this anguished, conflicted woman with the Margaret I'd known. The Margaret who'd seemed confident and content, who'd never indicated she was carrying such a heavy burden, who'd appeared to live a transparent life while actually maintaining this elaborate secret. I asked Jennifer what Margaret had said about me in those final days in the hospital. When Margaret knew she was dying, when she'd had Jennifer come say goodbye, what had Margaret wanted her daughter to know? Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. She said Margaret had been very weak by then, hard to understand sometimes, but she'd been lucid enough to talk. She'd held Jennifer's hand and told her she was sorry for giving her up, sorry for not being there, sorry for all the years they'd lost. But Margaret had also said she was grateful that Jennifer had found her, grateful for the 10 years they'd had together, grateful that she got to know her daughter before she died. That had meant everything to her. Then Margaret had talked about me. She'd told Jennifer that I was a good man, that I'd been a wonderful husband, that our marriage had been real and meaningful even though it had been built on something she'd hidden. She'd asked Jennifer not to think less of her for keeping the secret, to understand that she'd been doing what she thought was necessary to protect what we had. Margaret had also asked Jennifer to do something after she died, to tell me the truth, to make sure I knew about Jennifer. Margaret said she'd been too cowardly to tell me herself, but she didn't want to die with the secret still hidden. She wanted me to know, even if it meant I'd be angry, even if it meant my memory of her would be complicated. She wanted the truth to finally come out. That's why Jennifer had stood up at the funeral, not to cause a scene, not to hurt me, but because Margaret had asked her to, because Margaret had wanted me to know before she was buried, before the secret was literally buried with her. I sat back in my chair absorbing this. Margaret had planned this, had orchestrated the revelation, had asked Jennifer to do what she herself couldn't do. Tell me the truth, destroy the illusion, force me to see the real Margaret, even though that Margaret was harder to understand and harder to forgive. Part of me was angry at Margaret for handling it this way, for not having the courage to tell me herself, for making Jennifer be the messenger, for dropping this bomb at her own funeral where I couldn't even talk to her about it, couldn't ask her questions, couldn't tell her how I felt. But another part of me understood. Margaret had been dying, weak and scared, facing the end. Maybe she genuinely hadn't had the strength for a difficult conversation. Maybe she'd been trying to protect us both from the pain of discussing it while she was still alive. Maybe asking Jennifer to reveal the truth after her death had been the only way she could manage it. I asked Jennifer what she wanted now. We'd established the facts, understood Margaret's motivations, knew how we'd gotten to this point. But what did Jennifer want going forward? Did she want a relationship with me? Did she want to be part of Margaret's family? Did she have expectations? Jennifer said she didn't have expectations. She understood this was complicated, that I needed time to process, that I might decide I didn't want any ongoing relationship with her. She'd respect whatever I decided, but she also said she'd like to know me if I was open to it. Not as a father figure. She'd had a father. Robert Campbell had been her dad. He'd raised her and loved her. She wasn't looking to replace him, but she'd like to know Margaret's husband, to hear stories about Margaret's life, to understand the woman her mother had been in the 42 years before Jennifer found her, to connect with the family Margaret had chosen, to have some link to her biological mother beyond their secret meetings. I told Jennifer I needed time, needed to figure out how I felt about all this, about Margaret, about the secret, about her. I wasn't ready to commit to any kind of relationship, but I wasn't ruling it out either. I just needed space to process. Jennifer said she understood, gave me her contact information again, said whenever I was ready, if I was ever ready, she'd be happy to talk more. Then she left. I drove home thinking about everything. About Margaret at 16 giving birth alone, about her carrying that secret for 40 years, about her finding Jennifer and building a relationship while hiding it from me, about her dying without ever telling me the truth herself. I thought about our marriage, thought 42 years together, thousands of days and nights, conversations and silences, joy and sorrow, building a life together, all of it real in one sense, all of it based on a hidden foundation in another sense. Did the secret invalidate everything else? Did Margaret's lying about this one thing mean everything else was a lie too? Or could our marriage have been genuine even though Margaret had kept part of herself hidden? I didn't know. Still don't know. It's been 3 months since Margaret died. 3 months since Jennifer stood up at the funeral and changed everything. 3 months of trying to reconcile who I thought Margaret was with who she actually was. I've been going through Margaret's things slowly, her clothes, her books, her personal effects, finding more traces of Jennifer throughout. A photo tucked into a book, a birthday card in a drawer. Small evidences of the secret life Margaret had maintained. Some of Margaret's friends have reached out. They'd heard about Jennifer's revelation at the funeral. Some were sympathetic, said they couldn't imagine how hard this must be. Others were judgmental, said Margaret should have told me, that keeping such a secret was unforgivable, that I had every right to be angry. A few admitted they'd suspected something, that Margaret had sometimes been vague about where she was going, that she'd mentioned a friend but never introduced anyone, that there had been small inconsistencies in her stories, but no one had imagined the truth. No one had guessed Margaret had a secret daughter. Michael has been visiting regularly, checking on me, making sure I'm eating and taking care of myself. He asked again about Jennifer, whether I'd decided anything about having a relationship with her. I told him I'd met with Jennifer, had a long conversation, understood more now about what had happened, but still wasn't sure what I wanted to do going forward. Michael said he'd reached out to Jennifer himself, had met her for coffee, wanted to know his biological cousin. He said Jennifer was nice, easy to talk to, that she reminded him of Margaret in certain ways, the way she laughed, the way she told stories. The genetic resemblance was subtle but real. He said if I decided I didn't want a relationship with Jennifer, he'd understand, but that he was planning to stay in touch with her. She was family, part of Margaret's legacy. He wanted to honor that connection. I told him that was fine, that he should do what felt right to him, that my feelings about Jennifer didn't have to dictate his choices. He was an adult. Margaret had been his aunt. He had his own relationship with her and his own feelings about all of this. After Michael left, I pulled out Margaret's journals again, read through them more carefully, looking for patterns, trying to understand her thinking, trying to see past my own hurt to understand hers. What I found was a woman who'd been trapped by a decision she'd made at 16, a woman who'd hidden a pregnancy because she was ashamed and afraid, a woman who'd given up a baby thinking it was the only option, a woman who'd tried to move forward but had never really let go. Margaret had built a good life, had married me, had been a good wife and a valued member of our community, but she'd also carried this wound, this loss, this missing piece. She'd thought about Jennifer every single day for 30 years before Jennifer found her. When Jennifer had reached out, Margaret must have felt joy and terror in equal measure. Joy that her daughter was alive and well and wanting contact. Terror that this connection would expose her secret, would force her to confront what she'd hidden, would potentially destroy the life she'd built. So she'd tried to have both. Tried to maintain her marriage while also having a relationship with Jennifer. Tried to keep both parts of her life separate. Tried to be two different versions of herself in two different contexts. It must have been exhausting, maintaining the lies, remembering what she'd told each person, creating elaborate cover stories for where she was going and what she was doing, living in constant fear of being discovered. But Margaret had done it for 10 years, until she got sick, until she knew she was dying, until she had to face the fact that her death would either bury the secret forever or force it into the open. She'd chosen to force it into the open, by asking Jennifer to reveal the truth at her funeral, by making sure I'd know even though Margaret herself wouldn't be there to explain or apologize or answer questions. Was that brave or cowardly? I still couldn't decide. Brave to want the truth told, cowardly to not tell it herself. Both probably. Margaret had been complicated, human, flawed, just like everyone else. I went to visit Margaret's grave a month after the funeral. Green Hills Memorial Park. Her headstone was in place now. Margaret Louise Holland, beloved wife, 1967-2024. Simple inscription. Nothing about being a mother. Nothing about Jennifer. Just what everyone had known about her. I stood looking at the headstone, thinking about what wasn't written there. The hidden parts of Margaret's life. The secret daughter. The decades of lying. The complexity of the real woman beneath the simple description of beloved wife. Someone approached. I turned and saw Jennifer. She looked surprised to see me. Said she came every week, brought flowers, sat with Margaret for a while. She hadn't expected to encounter me here. I asked if she wanted me to leave, give her privacy with her mother. She said no, that we could both be here, that we both loved Margaret, that we both had the right to mourn her. So we stood together at Margaret's grave, the husband and the daughter, the two people Margaret had kept apart while she was alive, united now by her death and by the secret that had finally been revealed. Jennifer said she'd been thinking about what to put on Margaret's headstone, whether there should be some acknowledgement of their relationship, some indication that Margaret had been a mother, She knew legally she had no right to decide, that I was Margaret's next of kin, that the headstone was my choice, but she wondered if maybe someday there could be something, an additional inscription, or a separate marker nearby, something that said Margaret had been her mother, that their relationship had existed, that it had mattered. I surprised myself by saying yes, that we could add an inscription, loving mother of Jennifer, simple, true, an acknowledgement of what had been hidden for so long. Jennifer looked shocked, asked if I was sure, if I'd really be okay with that. I said I would, that Margaret had been Jennifer's mother, that hiding it had caused pain for everyone, that maybe it was time to stop hiding. We talked more that day at the cemetery, about Margaret, about our complicated feelings, about grief and anger and forgiveness and acceptance, about how you can miss someone desperately while also being furious at them, about how love and betrayal can coexist. Jennifer told me more stories about Margaret, about their lunches together, about conversations they'd had, about Margaret's sense of humor and her kindness and her intelligence. Things I already knew, but that felt different coming from Jennifer, like I was seeing Margaret from a new angle. I told Jennifer stories too, about our marriage, about trips we'd taken, about quiet evenings at home, about inside jokes and shared memories, things Jennifer hadn't known about her mother, parts of Margaret's life that had been hidden from her just as she'd been hidden from me. In sharing these stories, we were piecing together a more complete picture of Margaret. Neither of us had known the whole woman. I'd known Margaret as wife, but not as mother to Jennifer. Jennifer had known Margaret as mother, but not as wife to me. Together we were constructing someone fuller and more complex than either of us had understood alone. That was 4 months ago. Jennifer and I have been meeting regularly since then. Not frequently, once every couple weeks. Sometimes at the cemetery, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just phone calls. We're building something. Not a father-daughter relationship. That's not what either of us wants or needs. But something. A connection based on our shared love for Margaret. A friendship, maybe. An understanding that we're both part of Margaret's legacy. That we both carry pieces of her story. Michael has gotten close with Jennifer, too. They meet more often than I do. They're similar ages, have more in common. He's introduced her to other family members. Some have been welcoming, others remain uncomfortable with the situation. But slowly Jennifer is being integrated into Margaret's family in a way she never was while Margaret was alive. I've given Jennifer some of Margaret's things. Photos from our marriage that include Margaret at various ages. Jennifer has photos from Margaret's earlier life that she's copied for me. We're filling in gaps for each other, creating a more complete record of Margaret's 73 years. I added the inscription to Margaret's headstone last month. Beloved wife and loving mother. Simple acknowledgement of both relationships, both parts of Margaret's life. When I showed Jennifer, she cried, said it meant more than I could know, that having her relationship with Margaret publicly acknowledged after years of secrecy felt healing. People ask me how I'm doing, whether I've forgiven Margaret, whether I've moved past the anger. I never know quite how to answer, because I haven't moved past anything. I'm still in it, still processing, still figuring out how to understand my marriage and my wife and my own history. Some days I'm angry, furious that Margaret lied to me for 42 years, that she died without telling me herself, that she robbed me of the chance to work through this together while she was alive. Those days are hard, full of bitter memories and what-ifs. Other days I'm sad. Sad for Margaret carrying such a burden alone. Sad for Jennifer growing up without her biological mother. Sad for all of us trapped in a situation created by shame and fear and impossible choices made decades ago. Those days are gentler, but not easier. And some days I'm at peace, accepting that people are complicated, that Margaret was both the woman I knew and the woman with secrets, that our marriage was real, even though it was built on something hidden, that love doesn't require perfect transparency, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean choosing to move forward. I'm 70 years old now. Margaret has been gone for 4 months. I'm learning to live alone after 42 years of marriage, learning to cook for one, learning to sleep in an empty bed, learning to make decisions without consulting the partner I'd relied on for everything. But I'm also learning about the Margaret I didn't know, the 16-year-old who gave birth alone, the young woman who carried a secret for decades, the mother who found her daughter and chose to know her even though it meant maintaining an elaborate deception, the dying woman who wanted the truth told even though she couldn't tell it herself. This Margaret is harder to understand than the one I thought I married, more flawed, more human, more complicated, but also more complete, more real. The sanitized version of Margaret I'd believed in had been easier to love, but this fuller version, with all her complications and contradictions, might actually be worth knowing better. Jennifer calls me George now, not Dad, not Father, just George. We're figuring out what our relationship is, what it can be, what we want it to be. There's no roadmap for this, no guide for how a widower and his late wife's secret daughter should relate to each other, but we're figuring it out, one conversation at a time, one shared memory of Margaret at a time, one step forward into this new reality that neither of us chose, but that we're both living in. Last week, Jennifer asked if I wanted to see the house where she grew up in Cleveland, where Robert and Susan Campbell had raised her, where Margaret's daughter had become the woman she is. I said yes, I'd like to see that. I'd like to understand that part of the story. So next month we're driving up there together. Jennifer will show me her childhood home, the school she attended, the places that shaped her, and I'll tell her more about Margaret, about the woman who gave her life, who thought about her every day, who loved her even when they were apart. It won't bring Margaret back, won't undo the lies, won't make the past 42 years simpler or clearer, but it's something, a way forward, a way to honor Margaret by knowing both sides of her life instead of just the side she showed me. People in my community have been surprisingly supportive. Some initially treated me like a victim, poor George, deceived for his whole marriage. But most have moved past that. They've seen me with Jennifer, seen that we're building something positive from this complicated situation. They've stopped pitying me and started respecting that I'm choosing how to respond to what happened. A few have shared their own stories, hidden pregnancies, secret children, adoptions that were never discussed. I've learned that families are full of secrets, that the 1980s and earlier were different times. That many people carry histories they've never fully revealed. Margaret wasn't unique in keeping secrets. She was just unlucky that hers came to light. Or maybe lucky, because Jennifer exists, because Margaret got to know her daughter, because the secret didn't die with Margaret but lived on in Jennifer, because there's something beautiful mixed in with all the pain and deception. I think about what would have happened if Jennifer had never found Margaret, if the adoption had stayed closed, if Margaret had died without ever knowing her daughter. That might have been easier for me. No shocking revelation at the funeral, no complicated processing of hidden truths, just a clean grief for the wife I'd lost. But it would have been worse for Margaret. She'd have died never knowing what happened to the baby she gave up, never meeting the woman that baby became, never having the chance to explain or apologize or build any kind of relationship. That would have been its own tragedy. So maybe this is the better outcome. Messy and painful but honest. The truth is out. The secret is revealed. Jennifer and I both know the full Margaret, and we can choose what to do with that knowledge. I'm choosing to move forward, to accept that my marriage was complicated, that Margaret was complicated, that love and lies coexisted in ways I'm still trying to understand, that I can miss Margaret while also being angry at her, that I can grieve what I lost while also discovering what I didn't know I had. Jennifer is part of my life now, part of Margaret's legacy, part of the complicated truth of who we all were and are. I didn't choose this. Margaret forced it on me by asking Jennifer to reveal the secret. But I'm choosing how to respond, and I'm choosing connection over isolation, understanding over bitterness, moving forward over staying stuck. Does that mean I've forgiven Margaret? I don't know. Forgiveness is complicated. Some days I think yes. I understand why she did what she did. I see how trapped she was by choices she made when she was just a child. I recognize that she loved me even while lying to me. That feels like forgiveness. Other days I think no. I'm still angry, still hurt, still processing betrayal that cut to the core of my identity and my marriage. That doesn't feel like forgiveness. That feels like ongoing pain that hasn't resolved into anything clear. Maybe forgiveness isn't a destination. Maybe it's a process. Maybe I'm in it. Maybe I'll always be in it. Maybe that's okay. Margaret left me a letter. I found it last month in her desk drawer. Sealed envelope with my name on it. She must have written it knowing she was dying, knowing the secret would come out, wanting to explain in her own words even though she'd be gone when I read it. I haven't opened it yet. I've carried it around for weeks, put it in my pocket every morning, taken it out and looked at it, but not opened it, because once I open it, that's the last new thing I'll ever hear from Margaret. The last message, the final communication. I'm not ready for that yet, But I will be, someday, when I'm ready to hear what Margaret wanted to say, when I'm ready for her explanation in her own handwriting, when I'm ready for that final piece of the puzzle. Until then, I'm living my life, spending time with Jennifer, visiting Margaret's grave, sorting through 42 years of memories, and trying to understand them in light of what I now know, learning to be alone while also building new connections, grieving and healing and growing and accepting. I'm 70 years old. My wife died 4 months ago. At her funeral, I learned she had a secret daughter I never knew about. It changed everything. But it didn't end everything. Life continues. Relationships evolve. Truth matters even when it hurts. Jennifer is having dinner at my house next week. Her first time in the home where Margaret and I lived. Where Margaret kept all those photos and letters and journals about Jennifer. Where Margaret lived her double life. It will be strange having Jennifer in that space, but also right. She's part of Margaret's story. She belongs here in a way she never could while Margaret was keeping her hidden. We'll look through more photos together, share more memories, keep building this connection that neither of us expected, but that we're both choosing. Keep honoring Margaret by refusing to keep her secrets anymore. Keep moving forward into whatever this new reality becomes. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.